Hello, this is Georgina Rose.
This is Nike.
This is Temperance.
And this is Anthony.
And welcome to Magnolias and Magic. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the differences between in-person versus online occultism. So this podcast has largely spoken about the online occult community. We've talked about issues in the community, but at times we have touched on things that happen in the in-person IRL community. When you've been practicing for a while, at some point you're probably going to want to make the shift where you start either going to events in person or going to shops, experiencing occultism in the real world and meeting other occultists face to face. At this point, things are going to change a lot, and there's going to be a lot of things you aren't expecting. So we wanted to make this as a little bit of a primer into what you may see, the types of practices that differ, how people treat people differently, how there's different types of groups, covens, and orders, how discourse online may not be caught up with in-person discourse. So there may be things happening that you're aware of that in-person people are not aware of, and vice versa. The type of conversations to expect, the different types of classes, circles that you'll encounter, and all the things that will change when you go from an online occultist to an in-person one, and some of our experiences with that. So let's break into it. But first, Temp has something she needs to say.
Well, I want to welcome Anthony into the podcast. For those of you listening, this is his first episode as a new host. He is joining the host team.
Hi, everyone.
Anthony is fantastic. He ran his own podcast for a while, interviewing people. Is very good. I believe you can still find those online. He has graciously agreed to join us here on Magnolias and Magic, for the reason that this will be my last episode as a full-time host. I have some solo projects that I'm going to be working on, and so Anthony has graciously agreed to join us and kind of fill that void and bring in new perspectives and new voices, because that's, as the community changes, voices change. So we're super excited to have him on, and we hope you love him as much as we do.
Oh, you guys are so sweet. I'll do the best I can, Temperance. Thank you for the welcome.
So for people who wouldn't know you, just like a brief 2-minute or something intro, do you want to tell us about you, your practice, any details? Could be anything. Could just be, hi, I'm Anthony, if you really want. But I know that some of our audience won't necessarily know you, so just for those who might want a little something,
You
taste.
You expect me to talk about myself and keep it under 2 minutes?
You're right.
No. So hi everybody. Hi listeners. My name is Anthony Wolfe. I guess I am a content creator. That's like my biggest public title, if you want to find me on the internet. Basically I am a witch. I guess I branded myself as a Hecatean witch because I work very closely with the goddess Hecate. Just about every single aspect of my spirituality she has her fingers in somehow. So I'm very into deity work, very into mythology, very into history. I've been dabbling in like ceremonial occultism, especially after my interview with Georgina a couple months ago, because I was very lacking in that knowledge department and she schooled me. Other than that, I run a podcast, or I guess we're in a little bit of a hiatus right now, but I had a podcast, season 1. It's called The Living Grimoire. I interviewed all 3 of you on there, actually, and I was so happy with how that came out, so thank you for being a part of that. Other than that, I guess there's not really much more to say other than I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to talk with you all. I'm excited to see where we can take the show.
Yay! And we're so excited to have you.
We're excited to have you. I think you're going to bring in some interesting perspectives, because I know it came up like during our interview, even as like your background with the different kinds of magic that you practice and the cultures that you're from. So it's going to be interesting to have those voices displayed in this podcast.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I have my hands in a lot of honeypots, so we're going to see where it's coming from.
You'll fit in just fine. We're all very stretched people when it comes to what we're doing at all times.
I think first in this discussion, we should talk about like what the type of spaces are, so we can get a little bit of a foundation of the differences.
Like in the internet community?
Yeah, well, online you see content creators' pages you follow, you see subreddits, Discord servers, chat rooms, Facebook groups. So typically you're either just viewing content passively, or like sitting in your apartment watching things, scrolling, or you're talking with people digitally Whereas in person, there's a actual wide variety of spaces. There's covens, there's orders, there's shops, there's classes, there's festivals and events. Some of those do translate online because of COVID. People have started having like events that stream as well. But I think that'd be the best thing to break into first.
But even with the difference between IRL versus online, it's definitely going to vary based on sort of where you are or what you're doing. So like online versus IRL astrology versus online versus IRL Wicca, like the specifics are really going to vary. But I think generally it's with few exceptions, because I would say that like Twitter is one of those that it has sort of its own culture. But the online space definitely is, for better or worse, more vocal about a lot of things in every direction versus IRL stuff. I think people are often a little bit more reserved because they're testing the waters. You're physically in front of people, and so there's a little bit more. I don't want to say danger, but maybe like pressure or stress behind talking to people about what you do versus online. You can say a little bit more, you can do a little bit more, and there's less worry about any physical repercussions or getting kicked out of groups, because it's way easier to find spaces online versus finding a new group to hang out with or talk to in real life.
Oh, totally. If you're a New Yorker who's listening to this and you've like met me at a class or an open event, you'd know that I'm very different in person. I'm not like firing off hot takes. I'm just typically participating in the group ritual or sitting in the class and taking notes. I think people online are going to inherently behave differently because of that level of detachment. And also there's a different hierarchy, right? Like online as a creator you have this kind of pedestal, whereas in person these creators don't have that. They're just kind of listening to who's leading or who's the priestess or who's the teacher, and so you find people are in a different sort of pecking order versus online.
The online pecking order is kind of weird because it's completely synthetic. Like, it's completely synthetic if you really think about it. Like, we consider the online pecking order, it goes a lot off of like followers and subscribers. No matter what platform you're on, whether it's YouTube subscribers, TikTok followers, Instagram followers, Twitter doesn't really have the same kind of pizzazz, but the pecking order a lot of the time online is like authors, like published authors and influencers. And the influencers is it's such a platonic, I don't know if that's even the right word that I want to use, but it's such a surface level way for us to create this hierarchy of knowledge and direction within the community, because these people aren't typically chosen like by the community. They get chosen by the algorithm. And that's not to say that people don't deserve the followings that they have. It's not a hot take. I'm not subtweeting anyone. It's just, if you know and understand algorithms, you can get into that algorithm, whether your content's good or bad. As long as you're making content and you're making people react to you or listen to you, you'll be given that platform. So the way that we choose online, like the way we choose the online hierarchy, to me has always felt a little off.
Mm-hmm. No, I'm glad you brought that up, actually, because that's actually, I was brainstorming ideas for what I wanted to say about this topic, and that was what I kept coming back to, is just like the representation of occultism or spirituality you see on the internet. It's a lot more superficial, like you were saying, than anyone's practice would probably be in real life. And the people who are rewarded for, like what you're saying, the people who get rewarded in the algorithm, it's not necessarily about the quality of information or like the depth of spiritual knowledge you bring to the table. It's much more about how good you are at branding, or how good you are at video aesthetics, or how good you are at taking photos and posting them on Instagram. And so the hierarchy that you're talking about, it's not so much built up like in real life spaces. And even, I guess, probably back in the early days of the internet, the hierarchy was built upon like names who had been in the community for generations, like Lori Cabot. I remember watching her YouTube videos like back in the early 2000s, and like she's been in the community forever and a day. But nowadays it's like Instagram influencers, it's teenagers who get extremely popular off of one TikTok dancing video. Like it's not the same dynamic as it used to be, or that it probably is in real life.
It also takes a lot longer to be a respected community member in person.
Mm-hmm.
Like, to have a high position in an order or coven, like I know in Thelema in like the Thelemic order system, I mean, it takes like at least 6 months to go up even 1 degree if you're moving like at rapid fire speed, which most
You're
people don't.
dedicating years inside of
Yeah.
traditional initiatory circles. Like you're
Even
not dedicating like 6 months. Like 6 months, you could get 100,000 followers on the internet, but in an order, you're probably not very far off the ground.
Mm-hmm.
even our local coven that I've spoken of before, which they're not bad people. I just don't agree with them ideologically. Like they're very anti-hex. So even disagreeing with them that way, there's still a lot of respect that is given to them because they're in that position. They've been in their tradition for decades. They've run circles. They've been in their group for a long time. And while I think that's one of the other things too is that the it's not just the length of time, but it's also that they're much more often. It's not always the case, but much more often they're very focused on one area. So like this local coven and many of the ones that I've spoken to or heard about, usually it's Wiccan, but it could be anything else. But for this example, Wiccan. They've been in this specific Wiccan tradition for decades. They've learned all of the ways that go with that. They've gotten very immersed in their tradition, their history, all of the things that go with it. Versus in online spaces, I find that people are a lot more diverse, for better or worse. In some ways, it's very, very good, of course, to know more about other traditions, to be able to incorporate more things, to learn about more areas, to be more experienced. But it also means that because you're spreading out what you're learning about and what you're into and what you're incorporating, it means that you're not going to be like level 30 of one thing. You're going to be like level 5, level 7, level 8 of a bunch of different things. And while that's great, there is definitely a difference, not good or bad, better or worse, just different in having a little bit of everything versus very knowledgeable about one or two things.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the thing about online information too is like, it's like Temperance was saying, like it can take an entire lifetime to build up like an entire in-depth spiritual practice. And like anybody, like I don't care what kind of, like how good of a creator you are, like trying to take that and compress it into bite-sized information on the internet, like stuff is going to get lost. And so if you're one of the members of the younger generation coming in, getting all of your information off of like YouTube videos or things that people are posting in their Instagram captions, like things are going to get lost there no matter what. And it's only ever going to stay surface level. It's extremely hard to go, like Georgina's videos on ceremonial magic, those are the first time I've ever seen someone go like in depth into like ceremonialism, for example. And like it's very difficult to find those types of rabbit holes to get lost down.
And even then, like my videos are just the surface springboard, which I made at
Exactly.
the beginning. Like I'm covering like as light as possible. Like those videos, you're not going
Exactly.
to learn everything from. You have to keep going.
Mm-hmm.
Something that I found when you mentioned the younger generation thing, I remember when I first went to an occult event in person, like the very first one I ever went to. I was, I think, 18 at the time, and everyone there was like a decade older than me.
Yeah.
I remember being really surprised because I went to a Thelemic event. It was the first thing I ever went to. It was a Thelemic thing. And I was like at least a decade younger than almost everyone there. I remember like because I'd been on the internet, I'm like, everyone's in their early 20s too. And I got there and I was like, whoa, our community like is a different demographic than I was expecting.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's something that certainly some spaces do veer younger, but I remember finding that surprising personally.
Mm-hmm.
Well, like Gen Z tends to gravitate towards the internet, and it's unfortunate for them, and it's a hallmark that I'm interested to see how the future of our community as a whole is going to handle this. Is Gen Z is kind of the first generation that's had to be online when they first got into or interested in witchcraft and paganism due to the pandemic, because a lot of people became interested in, got super involved in, and started learning during the pandemic. Like we saw those numbers rise online in the community. Like, so this is a large group of people who have never had the opportunity to find real life in-person events just because everything's been closed and shut down.
Mm-hmm.
I would love. I couldn't even begin to think of what predictions I could make about what it'll look like in 10 years, but I would love to see in 10 years the people who have been in for 10 years, the people starting right now, because
Mhm.
I couldn't, I don't even know, because it changes so fast. That's one of the other things, is that the pacing, either like politically, progressively, and what is popular, what people learn about, what kind of content's being put out for people to learn about, the pace is so much different than in real life, because in real life it's very slow, much like with people being in charge, people being respected, getting, I don't want to say clout, but like community respect takes so much longer in real life. It's the same with learning, especially if you're being solitary in person versus solitary in online. Solitary online, you can still talk to other people, but solitary in person, usually it's much more just you learning on your own, practicing on your own. Maybe you have one or two people you can talk with. So some of it's also about that pacing, that the online stuff travels so differently, and if that pace is going to be something that really keeps up, or if it's going to be something that people eventually slow down and really like take their time and get into. I wonder if that pace is ever going to change at all.
I feel like it'll have to, because I feel like online we almost have like fast fashion style trend cycles with what practices
Mhm.
are popular. Obviously, over time there's been shifts. Like Wicca was a big thing, then there was the traditional witchcraft thing. But now I feel like online, like the trendy spiritual practice TM, like shifts every couple months. Like
Mhm.
last summer, I remember the Fae was really popular. I don't really hear about the Fae anymore. Like sometimes I do, but it's not nowhere near where it was. Same with like the egg cleansing thing. Like no one talks about that now. Mold,
Crystals are what it is right now. Carnelian, moldavite.
yeah, but like it
Mm.
moves like at a fever pace. Like when we talked about like the big shifts between a, initiatory Gardnerian Wicca and solitary Wicca, like that was slow. That was not like a year. I feel like we've gotten to this like fever pace of of trendy practices
Mhm.
that I'm curious where that'll go. I think it'll eventually slow down. My conspiracy theory is that this peak of increasing interest in the occult is eventually going to kind of drop off and things will slow down, but I mean it hasn't really done that yet. So who
Well,
knows?
we have seen this cycle once prior that
Mhm.
I can easily recall, which would have been around the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
I mean, there's whole songs dedicated to witchcraft that pervade pop culture. So that was when Wicca was like first coming out as a religion, and it was Age of Aquarius type stuff in the media, and there was astrology was popping off at that period in time. The hippies were big, so we have this cycle where we saw like there was a pretty big like spiritual outpouring at that time, and then it abated in pop culture, and then it came back late. I would say in pop culture, I'm not talking about in general, but in pop culture became like a thing right around the time of the internet again.
Mhm.
um and the pace of the I think it is important to note the pace of the in real life community used to be dictated by literature, but it's not dictated by literature anymore. It's dictated by TikTok trends and internet trends and blog posts by people. Podcasts have a big role to play. YouTube videos, self-made content. These are all things that are pushing the speed of the community, and you have so many voices shouting into this void of whatever this is. So the speed of the community, depending on who you are and how you relate to spirituality, is different, because someone who's disconnected from the internet is going to be moving a lot slower. And that's not slower in their spiritual journey, but a lot slower in terms of ideas and what's popular. They'll be moving a lot slower than someone who's constantly connected, because the internet's moving way faster than books are being published. So by the time a trend is popular on the internet, let's say you get a publishing contract, let's say the book is published within 12 months. That's really, really fast. It's probably going to be more than that. It's probably going to be 18 to 24, okay? Um, but let's just say for shits and giggles, it's 12 months, okay? So like the Fae are popular last July. Well, now books are coming out about the Fae now. So the the crowd that isn't really online, doesn't really care about what the internet's doing, they're reading these books. They're seeing these books come out talking about the Fae a lot more. But the internet community has moved on to Carnelian and Moldavite and astrology and whatever else that they're doing. So the two communities they exist within the same broader umbrella, but they don't tend to talk to each other as much as they probably should. I think there's generation gaps there too.
Oh yeah. I mean, when I talk to older Thelemites, because the Thelemic community is a little older, like I know some Thelemites in my area, and sometimes I'll talk to them, and it's almost like at times we're talking on like slightly different wavelengths because I'm so tuned in, right? I'm a Zoomer. As much as I'd like to say I'm pure Thelema through and through, since I'm so online, I'm gonna have that influence onto my practice. It's a very different thing, and it's interesting. We can have actually really engaging, interesting conversations, but like they're not aware of all this stuff. Like I'll talk about certain sort of discussions people are having. Like we've had a lot of recent discussions about the role of Crowley and Thelema. And Thelema, that's been a big, broad discussion, right? And people who are like offline have very different opinions than you see online. Like the popular narratives about where Crowley falls and Thelema on the internet versus speaking to real life Thelemites, very different. You'll notice this with other discourses too. Like if you're a Zoomer like me and you talk to like a Gen Xer in person about like some even the progressive discourse that's been in the community, like you're probably going to see some different opinions. And if you're hyper online, that may be a little jarring to you because you're used to like everyone having a consensus on something. But that consensus probably has not reached like the baby boomer pagans, you know? And
I
so
actually have a
because
recent example of this.
yeah.
My former roommate and I, and I've spoken about her before. She's also a witch. We didn't know this when we started rooming together. We were strangers. Good coincidence. But she is much more of like an IRL, do my own thing. There's a local coven that she sometimes speaks with, and she has like a couple of witchy people, but they're not super serious. When we were introduced, and so I'm so much more online, we had that same meeting of worlds where she suddenly began to learn about like ceremonial stuff and the Golden Dawn and Thelema. She'd never heard about any of it, or if she had, it was very limited. And so the things that she was focusing on or able to find for resources changed a lot. Now, her practice is still primarily like solo IRL, very much like doing her own thing, still goes to the public stuff. But her experience really very much changed. And so, she was able to, by getting a little bit more online and meeting somebody who was a little bit more tuned in online, it definitely did change that pace. And I think that if, because I know it's not just Gen Z, but generally, like now that the pandemic will wrap up eventually one day, if Gen Z decides that they want to get involved in IRL spaces, I think we're going to see a lot more of that happening, and I'm hoping that it's pretty productive. I'm hoping that it'll be a lot of that same experience of people who have been on their own IRL, slow, used to the regular, traditional pace of things, meeting with people who are hitting that speed, and both can influence each other both ways, where the online people can slow down a little bit, take topics one by one a little bit more, and learn from people who have been doing a lot longer. And the people who have been doing a lot more IRL can learn about these new things, and we can hopefully, praying, meet in the middle and find a good ground together where we can sort of hit a perfect blend.
Well, I think what we're going to see, because I'm already seeing it now, I can only speak for what I'm seeing in the state of Florida, but I work at a metaphysical shop a few days a week, and a lot of Gen Z people are getting frustrated that they can't access established groups. So they're just making their own. They're just winging it. They come in and they buy books and they buy crystals and they do it themselves. And I think that's a very pioneer-esque approach to group work, initiatory work, coven work. They're really kind of recreating the early 2000s in a way. They're bringing back the sense of coven small group versus coven initiatory established. It's interesting to watch happen. I think a lot of it is pandemic induced, but it'll be interesting to see how it plays out once restrictions lift.
Well, I think it'll get really interesting as well because the practices that people because I'm the token Zoomer on this podcast, are interested in are very different. We're seeing Wicca fall out of favor, which is a really seismic shift. I think that Gen Z is never going to return to Wicca. I could elaborate on that in a blog post or something. But I think that Wicca is going to start to decline. And because of that, there's not going to be these established groups, because when you seek out established groups, at least in New York, most groups are Wiccan. There are some Thelemic groups. There's some miscellaneous other groups, like there's some Druid groups and whatever, but the majority is Wiccan. So I think these people, when they seek out in real life communities, are going to look for like more, this is my theory, more non-denominational communities that are focused on doing rituals and less on a specific tradition. So I think we're going to see really seismic long-term shifts in what in-person groups look like, because I do think some of these older group styles are going to decline because of the changing interest of younger occultists. I don't really think we're going to revert back to the interest of the people ahead of us.
No, I completely agree with you, and I'm happy you talked about like the seismic overarching changes that we may be experiencing in the community. But it reminds me of this thing. I follow a lot of people that are in the author community because I have an entire writing online presence as well, aside from the occultism. And a lot of people in the author community are talking about this thing. It's a concept called the Metaverse, which is like the digital reality that is springing up from the internet. And the trend that a lot of people are seeing is that Gen Z is engaging more with the Metaverse in a lot of ways than they do with like actual reality. And so a lot of especially with the pandemic, now that we're phasing out of it, a lot of people were expecting like in-person meetups to going like coming back into style. A lot of people were expecting people to go out and like hang out at clubs, hang out at parties, go back to the movies. Like a lot of industries were ramping up to see a lot of foot traffic coming back. But what actually happened instead is Gen Z is starting to create online spaces where they can meet up and interact. Things like there was a bunch of high schools that hosted like graduations in Minecraft. I know of like my aunt at her corporation, she her entire company is doing meetings like in, I think it's oh, what is it, Fortnite? Like yeah, I don't play, but yeah, they're doing meetings in like Fortnite. I know of companies that are doing meetings in like just all kinds of different video games. I know there's platforms coming out that enable like AR and like virtual reality meetup spaces. And so I think like long term, maybe not like in the next 10 years, but like over the next several generations, because I don't think the internet is going away. I think it's just going to get more powerful, and I think we're going to find new ways to integrate it into our lives. I think the younger generations especially are going to start merging those in real life spaces with internet spaces, and it's going to become some kind of hybrid that I don't think any one of us has any kind of experience with yet.
Hybrid is exactly the word I wanted. Yes. I also, in this conversation with my former roommate, that was something we were talking about, because a lot of the people in the IRL group are a little bit more gentle of spirit, and they have never really been given good instruction on how to find resources, what magic even is, how a spell works. It's a lot of just you listen to the high priest and priestess and you do what they say and that's it. And so we were even talking about like, yeah, it would be nice to like do something physical at Circle, but I floated the idea of like, what if we did something hybrid where sometimes we could meet in person, but some of them are further away? What if we did like an online Zoom, Discord, something where we could sit down either on video or on voice and speak with them that way, so they could have some of the interaction, we could do some of the in-person, but definitely that hybrid was something that I really want to do more of, because I think that for all the hell it's been, we'll just leave it there. I think that the pandemic has helped to open up pathways to online accessibility, more learning resources, more people making content, and I think overall that's better. It comes with its own cons, we'll say, but it's given people more ideas on like where to connect with their community, how to find more people, and if there's nobody in your area, like where I used to live, only up until very recently, there was nobody around. Like now I'm in Minneapolis, so obviously Minneapolis is going to be much bigger, but where I was, not a big town, not a lot of people, not a lot of resources. Nearest witch shop alone is a 30-minute drive. So it for people that were in my position and still are, or will be long term, it's a lot easier to find some of those spaces online. So as much as like some of the online climate can be frustrating, I think that ultimately it does give a lot of resources for people who don't have anything else, and that's part of why a lot of people are solo in person because they have no one and they didn't know any resources, and now we've got a million places to go.
Exactly.
Well, I mean, we started to see that with certain like conventions and events in terms of pagan stuff. Like a lot of them now do streaming as well as in person. I know some shops near me are doing a thing where they've really enjoyed doing online like streaming classes. So they want to like do hybrid where if you're not in New York, you can like watch it online. But if you're in New York, you can go in person. I do think there's going to be that merging. I do think that that could cause some problems because certain people, like older occultists, may feel left behind.
Yeah.
I think in general, the technological accelerationism of society is a very mixed bag. I think for ritual space, it could cause some problems because I mean, I've hosted rituals online and I've been to rituals in person. It's harder to do a ritual online on a Zoom call. I've done it and I've done in person ones. I do find it harder. I do think for certain specific ceremonial rituals in particular, you miss out on certain aspects of the experience, like smelling the incense, seeing the candles, the disconnecting from the distractions, because there's something about being online that can be very distracting. It's easy to, while you're in the ritual, check your message pings or your emails. So I think certain things like that are cons of it. Personally, I do support the accelerationism of occult content onto the internet. I think it's a good thing because as someone from a small town, it does give more opportunities to people. And when I was younger, I really appreciated it. I would not be the occultist I am today without the internet. But I think we do need to acknowledge that these shifts within our community may have some downsides and certain things will not translate to the internet well. I mean, certain groups struggled and certain groups thrived during this. But some people did not benefit from it. Some people who are used to in-person rituals really struggled with doing rituals over Zoom and Skype. You know, I think that it is a change and I don't think it's all like, you know, roses.
I'm gonna say that I actually prefer it online for a number of reasons, but I prefer online, and I think that being online is what has caused this shift and interest into more niche aspects of the occult and pagan spaces. Specifically, like you can actually see it become tangible with Thelema. Like the people's interest in that has largely occurred during lockdown when Thelemites had to move online. Like that's within your community where we see that happening, and introducing it to new generations. I mean, TikTok has a Thelema talk. Like
We have over a million views on TikTok. Thelema has benefited from the pandemic, actually. The thing is, Thelema, though, prior to the pandemic, is actually having some shifts. I'm planning on talking about this a lot in the future, but we've got a big paradigm shift going on within Thelema. And Thelema has had a resurgence online recently when Thelema online was really lagging. TikTokers and Gen Z are getting into Thelema. So for us, we've really benefited. I mean, I've seen literally in local stores more Thelema books getting stocked. Like we're selling more. We're
Oh yeah,
gaining.
you were here with me when we went to that witch shop. They had books on Thelema and they had the Thoth Tarot, and I was shocked by that because the little shop that we had was the one with the Thoth Tarot. That was crazy. Like it's a tiny little shop in essentially a nothing town. There's nobody around. They're doing well for where they are, but they have stuff I would never have imagined they would have, and they just had Thelema.
I think what I've noticed is I think niche traditions really benefit from this. Popular mainstream traditions are going to struggle more and kind of lag behind. That's my theory. That's something I've noticed. The like big traditions people see when they first encounter tend to not be where they actually end up at the end due to the internet. But I think certain traditions will kind of lag behind because of all of this. But that would have happened in any other sort of major paradigm shift, you know? That's what's happened in the past. It'll happen to traditions in the future. Maybe Thelema will get replaced in like 20 years. We don't know. You know?
No, and something I think about too is like I remember there were a lot of news articles that came out over the last couple of years about how Gen Z, like now that Gen Z is getting older, we're able to I guess do statistics on them, and a lot of the statistics say that Gen Z like statistically moves away from institutions. It's inherently distrustful of like large the only word that's coming to mind is institution. But yeah, they don't like organized religion. They're moving away from structural institutions. They're very skeptical of like large societal systems. And so like in the religious community, they're seeing a large move of Gen Z or like Zoomers away from like organized Christianity, types of evangelicism, and that a lot of people theorize that's actually why we had such a large boom in the occult over the last couple years, is because the occult is a lot more eclectic and it lets you like survey a bunch of different belief systems without having to adhere to a structured tradition necessarily. And so apparently Gen Zers find that very attractive, just like based on their worldview. And I think that's one thing that is really cool about like at least how the community has taken to the internet so far. Like we're talking about the accelerationism and like the rapid pace that trends develop within the occult community. I think that a lot of people, maybe at least younger people, find that enticing because it lets them glance over a lot of different pieces of information very quickly versus having to commit to like reading an entire author to understand the tradition that the author's from.
I think that diversity in ideas too is getting really big because they move away from the organized stuff and they start going,
Mm-hmm.
well, what else is out there? And I think
Mm-hmm.
that online, and this is one of the things I love. I think this is a giant benefit to online. I think that we're able to see so many new practices because
Mm-hmm.
my first time around, for those who may or may not know, I was into witchcraft in high school and then dropped it for a while and then came back in my adulthood. When I was in high school, I didn't know anything existed outside of Wicca, which I think was a lot of people's experience. And now that I've been online, I know about Greek polytheism, Norse polytheism, Kemetic practices, ATR, folk practices, Italian folk magic, like all of these different things that I never, Thelema, ceremonial stuff, I never would have known about if I hadn't been fully exposed online. And I probably would have run across stuff eventually, but I wouldn't have the breadth of knowledge I have, even at just a low base level, to know anything about them. I wouldn't have known half of that if I had been only in person. I think that the online world, being able to have people say, what else is out there and where else can I go, and meeting all these new people that, maybe person A knows a lot about ATR, and person B is a very heavy Norse polytheist, and person C is a Greek polytheist, and person D is a Thelemite. All these practices, all these people come together and they discuss and they learn these new things, and you're able to meet all of these people in this space together versus in real life. My experience was in real life, you meet a lot of the people practicing the same thing, which is great, and you can learn a lot about that one thing, but you don't often get that diversity. And so I love that we're able to meet all of these practices together and to learn together.
Mm-hmm. One thing to bounce off of that too, I just wanted to note, like in my own personal experience, I have Korean heritage and I have Latino heritage, and maybe like 15 years ago when I started practicing, there was absolutely no cultural context for any type of spirituality that had to do with those with those cultural heritage. One thing that I really love about the way the community is developing online now, especially like you're saying, the diversity, it's really cool as a POC to be able to find so many different resources for things that are within your heritage nowadays. Cause like that wasn't a thing like 10, 15 years ago, like I was saying. And now like I could name off like 10, 15 different authors, creators, like YouTube creators that talk about like specifically like Asian spirituality or Asian witchcraft or like Latino spirituality and Latino witchcraft, and like that just didn't happen before. And so that's something that I wanted to note, like been a really awesome development with the internet.
I'm gonna come in and be the Debbie Downer now after I've said I prefer it and we've all agreed. Is that the internet has so many benefits, and its biggest downfall is that because it moves at a breakneck speed, the pipeline into more seedy, conspiratorial, anti-Semitic, white supremacist, any kind of negative trail that you could find is a lot easier to stumble into and a
Yeah.
lot quicker to fall down.
Oh,
Mhm.
yeah. Well, you see a lot of the more radical and dangerous occult movements. They don't have real presences in person. Like
Mhm.
if you look on your local areas, because a lot of the way that you can find these things, at least in New York, I find Eventbrite, looking around on like Witchvox archives. You can pull it up on the web archive. You can look through like Facebook pages and stuff. Like the ways that you find these groups, or even some of the shops here have like bulletin boards you can like look at. The groups represented are typically not seedy. They're typically reliable, and some of them have been around for like here in the city, some have been around for like over 20 years. However, on the internet, some of these organizations that are linked to some of these creators or are around that exist have ties to a lot more nefarious, dark stuff that, while in real life these groups exist, a lot of them do recruit from the internet. And a lot of the very extreme parts of occultism spread easier on the internet because in person, people who have been around for 30 years will be able to immediately clock that shit. On the internet, it gets a pass a lot of the time. And so you see people on the internet falling into much more extreme ideas and much more risky practices quicker because it's so easy to like join a Discord server, not realize it's a cult, and end up consuming content that's connected to terror adjacent occult groups because there's just less vetting and people are younger. They don't have like the elders to sort of look out for them, you know, and be like, hey, just for a heads up, don't go to this event. Don't meet up with these people. This member of the community has a bad history. Like things like that, you know, they don't exist on the internet. A lot more can fly and pass. And that leads to a cult problem. I think on the internet, we have a cult problem with occult cults on the internet. That they exist in person, but not to the same extent. And typically not with minors, because at least here in New York, pretty much every ritual you go to, you can't go to if you're under 18. So minors are at a lot more risk on the internet in the occult space.
Well, I think unfortunately what we're going to see is what we saw with the original cult boom, or what we consider the original cult boom from like the 60s, 70s, 80s, where Gen Z is very tired of establishment, which makes sense. So they're looking for things that are outside of that, and so they fall into these things that are, they paint themselves as anti-establishment, and you know, things like QAnon, things like conspirituality. They realize that there are parts of the system, very large parts of the system, that are broken and inherently evil in some cases. I'll put it bluntly. Some parts of the system are quite evil, and so they are searching for. Sir? They're searching for something that is outside of that, and so they end up in these groups that are like, yeah, we know that these things are bad, we'll tell you the truth. And they start at a place that is based in reality and then get them either into conspirituality that turns into anti-Semitism or white supremacy. And it's easier than ever to find groups. It's easier than ever to find groups. It truly is. And especially in online spaces where you can, in a way, isolate people differently. It's easier to form cult of personality, which we see a lot with content creation. Getting people to give you very personal information because you feel sort of detached from it. It does have its difficulties, and I do fear a little bit for the later end, like around my age, the later end of millennials and Gen Z, because they don't have that experience of you can just sign off, because a lot of people, it doesn't feel like that as reality because so much of our lives are online. School is online, work for a lot of people is online, like life is just online a lot of these days. And so for some people, the thought of just log off doesn't exist.
Well, and the in-person community has been down for the past 2 years. Here in New York, like, I was able to go to events pre-pandemic, but not for that many years. You know, I didn't have enough time to fully establish myself before all this happened. And then, like, here, the community's still pretty, like, not reopened for various reasons. So in a lot of places, I mean, I don't know when the in-person community will fully reopen. I think it's probably starting in other places. We're very strict in terms of COVID here, but things are just now sort of coming back to life. And so a lot of people are coming in with zero experience, which, you know, always leaves people susceptible. And they're coming in with such different ideas that I think things are going to be weird for people who are starting in person now versus people who tried to start in person like 4 or 5 years ago.
Well, I have seen, like, there's Discord servers and stuff and, like, little group chats where people will be like, oh, this is private and, like, we're part of a coven. And so the online initiatory practice is not the same as an IRL initiatory practice, because like the online initiation is basically saying like, yeah, I'll be in this coven, and there's like a few ways it goes. One is like, I will be in this private server and I won't tell anyone what we do, and then the other is like, yeah, I'll pay to be in this coven, I'll pay to be in your like whatever your which I'm not, whatever, that's
I
like
mean,
your
real
business.
groups do have fees. You have to pay like a due if you're in Thelema. Like if you join a Thelemic organization, you have to pay dues. They're not much. It's basically so people can keep the lights on. Or like if you go
But
to
online it's
like
different
a
because they're being
mandatory donation. That's what we call it in Thelema, the mandatory donation.
okay, but see, the difference is IRL it makes sense because you're in a physical space, but when you're online and you're just in a private section of a Discord server, I don't know, it feels different to me.
Yeah. Also, like online classes, there's typically less rigor to teach than an in person. Because you can just like set up a Discord or a Skype chat and like teach a class. Whereas in person, you typically have to have a reputation with a store or an event that takes like years of establishing yourself within a community to do. Also, there's a lot less things people who run, like if you run a Discord coven, there's a lot less you have to worry about. And so the sort of bar to entry is a lot lower.
And for a lot of initiatory traditions, there's a lot more physicality to it, where there's there's just rituals. There's like physical rituals, which, as we've said, are kind of hard to do online versus in person, and some of them require testing people magically, doing ceremonial things to them magically to prepare them for certain things. A lot of the physical movement required, some of the supplies required, are going to be very different. So initiating online versus in person just doesn't really work out. And you can do some of the learning, but ultimately, to me, I think the only way you could mix online versus in person for initiatory stuff would feel like a hybrid college class.
Yeah.
And by that I mean like you do a lot of the stuff online at home, you do video lectures, whatever, check-ins, meetups, whatever. But there's still going to be physical, in-person, practical exams where you have to go in, you have to do something. It would feel like taking a science lab hybrid online, where you have to come in and do the experiments, you have to be in the lab, you have to do the physical testing, you have to be using the equipment and showing you know how to physically do it versus just talking about it. And you really would have to do that physical stuff for an initiatory tradition, because they do require that physical rigor, the doing of something to be able to show that you can do it, or for a lot of people for it to work at all, because just talking about it doesn't necessarily mean a thing is done. So I think at best you could only do about 50-50 online versus in person, and you can't do 100% online for initiatory, is my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think collectively as a society, we've learned some meetings can be an email.
Yes. Yes, very much. Well, it's accessibility too, right? I want to say for a lot of chronically ill or disabled folk, it's great to have some of the stuff online, and it makes it so that they can conserve their energy for these one or two big specific things versus needing to go every single week, and it's a whole ordeal to get up the energy to go and to get yourself ready and to be ready for the physical space, whatever the challenges there may be, either from overstimulation or being overwhelmed, or having your medication set to go and having emergency supplies with you. If you are physically disabled in any sort of way, just leaving the house sometimes can be a big difficult issue there. So it does add accessibility in certain ways to make the in-person requirements lower, but I think ultimately there will still be at least some of that barrier for people in that position. It just takes some of that burden off, which I would think is helpful.
You can find bad shit on any website if you look hard enough. I mean, it's the internet. People post bad opinions at all times.
Mm-hmm.
I think Tumblr is one of those sites that like really exemplified the first wave of like how internet dogma becomes somehow verified communal gnosis.
Mm-hmm.
Because we had Tumblr, which is doing a lot of out of the box weird things, and people that had been in the community for a while were like, "What the heck is this?" and then somehow it just became accepted in the norm, and like now we see that like every day with TikTok and Instagram and Twitter and whatever else is going on.
I always
why
think
we
of
have-
emoji magic.
Emoji spells are 100% real. Can you not?
No,
100%
they're
techno
totally
witchcraft.
valid. I'm just saying that's the first time I ever heard of them was on Witchblur.
That's
Same.
a Witchblur invention. That's
That
a
is a
Witchblur
Witchblur
tradition,
invention,
no sir.
yeah.
I did actually
Mhm.
have a conversation with this, just super brief sidebar. It's related, it's internet. I had a conversation about this with Astra on her podcast about like digital witchcraft, and essentially what it came down to was that I think emoji spells are halfway there, but
Okay, my final thoughts are that you're going to have a very different experience in person. When you enter the real world community, have an open mind. Don't expect it to be just like the people you know in your Discord or on TikTok. Expect to be there different perspectives, different voices, people who aren't your age, people from different cultures and backgrounds. Don't expect it to be the same as the sort of echo chamber we tend to fall in on the internet. Have an open mind and you'll see where the community leads you.
wow, shorter this week.
I know.
My final thoughts are that I can't wait to see where we go, honestly. I want to see the mixing of IRL versus online. They are inherently different, but I think that there's a lot that both could teach the other, and I'm hoping that we're able to mix them in a way that is healthy and productive for both sides of that spectrum, and that we are able to find ways to continue to help accommodate those who find it easier to do stuff online, to, in a sense, turn meetings that could be emails into emails, and keeping the more important stuff and conserving our resources all around for the IRL stuff, and to make those a little bit more special, I think. So that's the hope, to make things hybrid.
My final thoughts are that you are valid and your practice is valid. And whether it's mostly internet based or online based, you can use as many emojis as you want and they will work.
My final thoughts are that the internet has done a lot of things for our community. It has primarily blown up our community in many orders of magnitude, with all of the pros and cons that come along with that. And I, like Nike said, I'm just very excited to see where our community transitions to over the next decade or so as we grapple with this blossoming community we have to deal with on a daily basis.
Patrons, you help keep our show running. So I would like to say a special thank you to all of our patrons who are $10 and over, because you get a thank you by name from me. You're welcome. So a big thank you to Victoria. When we have some new people too, I see you. The Lady Ghost, I know that you're new. Rose, Ree, Nicole, Nico, Neon, Nauseated, Mike, Megan, Marshall. I love Marshall. Lisa, I still don't know how to pronounce your name, and I'm very sorry. Leon T or Leon Tiy? We'll find out one day. Lee, Kat, Jessica, Doitsu, The Rising Witch, Jonah, Janine, Jay, Evan, Barry, and Amy Monster. You guys help keep the show running, and we love you very much. So you're welcome for the extra crazy that we get to give you every week.
And if you want to support the show, get extended shows, pre-shows, and more, we have a Patreon. Support us on Patreon, and you get all sorts of lovely things. If you want to find me, I'm .darling, DAAT, on all major social media platforms, excluding Facebook. So find me there.
And I'm Nike. You can find me at the Warrior Witch Nike pretty much everywhere, Warrior Witch on Twitter, or I have an astrology Twitter that's Astro Witch Nike, because I know what my own platforms are. Georgina and I stream on my Twitch Mondays and Tuesdays. We'll be doing some Wednesdays coming up in the future, so stick around and keep your eyes out for that. That'll be fun. That's me.
I'm Temperance. You can find me at Wildwoman Witchcraft on most of the internet. My book Year of the Witch is available to purchase pretty much anywhere books are sold.
My name is Anthony, and you can find me at Anthony the Witch on just about any social media platform, and you can also find me here on Magnolias and Magic from now on. So,
Yay!
very exciting.
Yay!
And this has been Magnolias and Magic. We did it.
This has been Magnolias and Magic.
Yay!